Hello and welcome. In this segment of the Quality Assurance Measures training video, we'll be covering Part 2 of the Quality Assurance Measures Regulation, which applies to all service agencies. Service agencies will ensure that if they use a third party to provide services and supports to a person with a developmental disability, that they too comply with these regulations. Third parties do not include the purchase of professional or specialized services, such as clinical supports. Service agencies that contract with third parties for services and supports on behalf of persons with a developmental disability will have a contract with a third party that outlines the quality assurance measures that the third party is responsible to meet and how the service agency will monitor the third party's compliance with these quality assurance measures. There are several quality assurance measures, and we will be speaking to each one of them. The promotion of social inclusion, individual choice, independence, and rights requires agencies to place a focus on social inclusion, individualized approaches, and the rights of persons who receive services and supports. To achieve this, agency policies and procedures must contain a mission statement that promotes the social inclusion, independence, and rights of persons with developmental disabilities. A mission statement outlines the agency's values and principles. It explains how it provides services and supports and how it treats people. The mission statement must promote social inclusion. This means supporting people to be a part of the community where they live. Agencies must have a written statement that includes service principles that promotes individualized approaches to supporting persons with developmental disabilities. A service principle describes the service philosophy and the approaches for service delivery. Agencies must have a statement of rights, which is a statement that outlines the rights of persons with developmental disabilities who receive services and supports. The statement of rights must promote social inclusion, individual choice, and independence. What are the requirements for implementing quality assurance measures that promote social inclusion? To ensure that each person receiving supports and services is empowered and supported to make their own decisions and acknowledging their right to self-determination while balancing the level of risk of a person's decisions, you will conduct a mandatory orientation of your agency's mission statement, service principles, and statement of rights with the persons with a developmental disability, new staff members, new volunteers, and new members of your board of directors. And conduct an annual refresher of the mission statement, service principles, and statement of rights thereafter with persons with a developmental disability, staff, and volunteers. Ensure that the board of directors conducts an annual review of its mission statement, service principles, and statement of rights, which shall include any updates as necessary. Keep a record of all orientations, refreshers, and reviews. Each person receiving supports and services will have the opportunity to express their own views about important decisions concerning themselves and to have the opportunity to participate in the decisions that affect their life. To clearly articulate the services and supports that the service agency will provide for each person and how those services and supports relate to the person's goals. Each person with a developmental disability will have an individual support plan, and they will participate as fully as possible in the development and annual review. An individual support plan is a written document developed by a service agency that identifies specific strategies that are to be undertaken to help the person achieve their goals. It outlines the services and supports that are to be provided to the individual. Many different types of support plans exist that meet the quality assurance measures requirements. However, the individual support plan shall identify 1. The persons who were involved in its development. 2. That all relevant parties are kept fully informed and that no area of the support plan is overlooked. 3. The specific short-term and long-term goals of the person with a developmental disability. 4. Other community resources that may be required, including medical, vocational, recreational, cultural, religious, and social resources. 5. The specific funded services and supports that are to be provided to the person with a developmental disability, such as passport, community participation supports, ODSP, 6, actions required to achieve expected outcomes, 7, the persons responsible for implementing the actions, including setting out their roles and responsibilities, 8, the manner in which services and supports are to be provided, 9, the amount of allocated resources, such as the amount of or number of hours of ministry-funded developmental services and support, for example, residential support, community participation support, speech and language. While not necessary, ODSP cost recovery could also be noted. In the future, when ministry funding is allocated on an individualized basis, the individualized budget will be included. 10, the date of review to update the individual support plan to clarify goals, expected outcomes, and allocated resources. 11, documentation on areas where the person is most vulnerable and any necessary safeguards to protect the health and safety of the person, such as supervision and environmental controls within the home and community. And 12, the level of support the person has requested or requires to manage their day-to-day finances. An individual support plan is different from a person-directed plan or person-centered plan. An individual support plan focuses on the identification of personal goals and outcomes to be achieved over the course of a year with ministry-funded support provided by the agency. A person-directed plan may be broader, encompassing short and longer-term goals, as well as support from a variety of sources in the community. Each service agency needs to discuss with each person with a developmental disability, both during the development of the individual support plan and at its annual review, if they would permit the information to be shared with persons other than agency staff members. It is necessary that the date of the individual support plan and the dates of any updates of the plan are recorded. Some people who have a developmental disability can look after their own money and banking. Others need help. For situations where people need help, service agencies will have policies and procedures to manage the personal finances of persons with developmental disabilities, where the person requests assistance or the assistance is identified in the individual support plan. For example, this could include help with budgeting, bank transactions, personal record keeping, and support to understand bank information, such as statements or application forms. This requirement does not, however, refer to making financial investments. Note that it is not a requirement that an agency provide assistance to an individual with their finances. The regulation sets out requirements for agencies in the event that they provide assistance to the individual with his or her finances. For any persons assisting with the management of finances that is acting on behalf of the person with a developmental disability, the service agency should note this in the person's individual support plan and/or the person's file. The service agency should prepare and maintain separate books of account and keep financial records to the best of its ability. There will be an annual review of the account books and financial records by a third party. An independent review of accounts and financial records may be provided by persons who are not affiliated with those who provided the individual with assistance with their finances. For example, a family member, review committee, struck by the agency, or an independent accountant. It is important to also consider the requirements for privacy and confidentiality during the independent review of accounts and financial records. The review will include a report for the Board of Directors. To promote health and well-being among persons receiving services and support from the agency, service agencies will have policies and procedures regarding public health information to help persons with a developmental disability make informed choices about their health. This includes nutrition, diet, fitness, and hygiene. Also, service agencies will have policies and procedures to monitor the health concerns of persons with developmental disabilities, where the supports have been identified in their individual support plan. Policies, procedures, and documentation are required for several aspects of a person's health and for the administration and storage of medication. Policies, procedures, and documentation should include and recognize the choices that the person receiving services from the agency may make regarding their health and well-being. These include medication administration, access to medication, and the storage of prescribed and non-prescribed medication for each location medication is provided. Documentation could include medication administration records, medication schedule, master medication sign-off sheets, medication errors and refusals to take prescribed medication. Documentation could include medication error forms, medication incident records, and any records of refusals. The transfer of medication between different locations where the person with a developmental disability is receiving services and supports. Documentation could include medication transfer records, medical services that are provided to the person with a developmental disability. Documentation could include annual medical forms, medical appointment summary forms, cumulative health records, healthcare treatment records. Emergency medical services. Documentation could include critical incident or accident reports. To ensure that each person receiving supports and services knows and understands the potential outcomes of their choices, including persons acting on their behalf, by providing information necessary to make informed choices, service agencies will ensure that public health information is available and presented in a language and manner and with the level of support that the person with a developmental disability needs, such as plain language brochures and booklets, and ensure they have policies and procedures, including documentation regarding refusals to obtain or accept medical services that are recommended by a legally qualified medical practitioner or health professional. To ensure all service agency staff are trained to meet each person's basic and special health care requirements and treatment needs in everyday situations and emergencies, service agencies shall provide training to its staff members on first aid and CPR, or arrange for the training to be provided by a third-party health or medical professionals. Compliance with the regulations could include copies of training certificates, staff training records form. Training is also required on any special health intervention, such as G-tubes and insulin administration. Service agencies shall provide training to staff on meeting the specific needs for the health and well-being of persons with a developmental disability, which include training on any controlled acts required. A controlled act is defined within the meaning of Section 27 of the Regulated Health Professions Act, 1991. Compliance with the regulations could include initial orientation checklists, acknowledgement forms, protocol sign-off sheets, and staff meeting minutes. To ensure that each person is supported in a safe and respectful environment where abuse will not be tolerated, all service agencies will address abuse prevention and reporting in their policies and procedures. Service agencies must have policies and procedures that explain zero tolerance towards all forms of abuse of persons with a developmental disability and review the policies and procedures at least once a year. The purpose of the review is to prevent occurrences. A record of the review, any required changes, and their implementation must be documented. Abuse means an action or behavior that causes or is likely to cause personal physical injury or psychological harm, or both, to an individual with a developmental disability. Abuse includes any type of physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, and financial abuse. Abuse also includes neglect. Neglect means the failure to provide an individual with a developmental disability with the support and assistance that is required for their health, safety, or well-being, and includes inaction or a pattern of inaction that jeopardizes the health or safety of the person. Service agencies are required to have policies and procedures regarding documenting and reporting any alleged, suspected, or witnessed incidents towards persons with developmental disabilities. It is necessary that service agencies have policies and procedures to include the manner of support offered to the persons with a developmental disability who has alleged, suspected, or witnessed abuse. Service agencies will have policies and procedures to deal with staff and volunteers who have abused or are alleged to have abused. To ensure that each person receiving supports and services, service agency staff, board members, and volunteers understand what constitutes abuse and are prepared in advance and clearly understand the procedure to be followed to deal with all abuse allegations. Staff members and volunteers who have direct contact with persons with developmental disabilities must complete mandatory training on abuse prevention, identification and reporting, and a refresher course taken annually thereafter. Compliance with the regulation could include staff and volunteer training records, annual performance reviews. Board of Directors will undergo an orientation of the policies and procedures on abuse prevention, identification, and reporting. A refresher course is required annually thereafter. When a person with a developmental disability starts to receive services and supports, education and awareness training on abuse prevention and reporting will be done and reviewed annually. Lastly, an annual review of a service agency's policies and procedures on abuse prevention is required and should be updated as determined by the review. In the case of a criminal offense, where any suspected, alleged, or witnessed incidents of abuse occur with a person with a developmental disability, it must be reported immediately and directly to police. It is up to the local police to determine whether an incident is or is not a criminal offense. Consent from the victim is not required in order to report a possible criminal offense to the police. The regulation on quality assurance measures requires service agency staff to report all incidents of witnessed, suspected, or alleged abuse to the police. Service agencies must report incidents before starting to conduct an internal investigation. This will help to prevent any contamination of evidence. Once the police have conducted their investigation or have indicated that no further investigation is necessary, the service agency may undertake an internal investigation as outlined in their policies and procedures. This does not prevent the service agency from taking appropriate steps to support the alleged victim, such as making sure the person is safe or has medical attention. Service agencies will have policies and procedures on the notification of anyone acting on behalf of the person with a developmental disability of an alleged, suspected, or witnessed incidents of abuse. And we will have policies and procedures on notification that require the service agency to obtain the consent of the person with a developmental disability before notifying others. Ontario has laws about protecting the privacy and confidentiality of personal information. Service agencies must obey these laws. To protect the personal information of each person receiving supports and services, to ensure that the service agency has considered and articulated how personal information will be collected, used, and disclosed, service agencies will have policies and procedures that comply with all applicable privacy legislation. Agencies must ensure privacy and confidentiality obligations under any funding agreement made under the Act. The policies and procedures must include that the person with a developmental disability provides consent for any collection, use, or disclosure of personal information. It is important for persons receiving services and supports and anyone acting on their behalf to understand the agency's policies and procedures on confidentiality and consent. Agencies will review these policies and procedures with them. The review should be made appropriate to the capacity of the person with a developmental disability. Compliance with the regulation could include intake record, acknowledgement forms. Agencies are required to train staff members and volunteers and provide an orientation to new members of Board of Directors regarding policies and procedures about privacy and confidentiality and consent to collection, use or disclosure of personal information. Compliance with the regulation could include an oath of confidentiality form. To ensure that each service agency takes steps to promote and maintain a safe environment, service agencies must have an approved fire safety plan for each location, an emergency preparedness, and a plan to address situations where there is a service disruption. Service agencies must ensure that all premises meet all provincial fire and health safety requirements. All agency-operated premises will have an approved fire safety plan. A request will be made to produce the approved fire safety plan. Compliance with the regulation requires a fire safety plan that is signed off by the local municipal fire department. Service agencies must have an emergency preparedness plan for emergency situations that may occur inside the premises. This could include power outages, fire, flood, storm damage, pandemic and medical emergencies. Also, service agencies will develop an emergency preparedness plan for emergency situations that occur outside the premises, such as the person runs away or becomes lost. To ensure that each service agency takes steps to promote and maintain a safe living environment, staff must receive training in the procedures outlined in the Emergency Preparedness Plan. A continuity operational plan will ensure safety around the service agency premises during a service disruption. A service disruption is a situation that prevents you from continuing to operate your business either in your regular location or in its usual way. Service agencies will ensure that all equipment used or around the premises is maintained as directed by the manufacturer. Policies and procedures are necessary regarding the maintenance of equipment and shall include maintenance recommendations by the manufacturer. Documentation will be needed to indicate that equipment is maintained or inspected as required. This could include fire extinguishers, sprinkler and alarm systems, mechanical lifts and elevators, heating and cooling equipment. Agencies would also need to keep their smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, and fire extinguishers in good working order. Service agencies will consider, articulate, and provide adequate support for the personal safety and security of persons receiving services and supports. Note that support may be in the form of staffing or other means to protect personal safety, such as non-slip mats on floors, mechanical lifts, or locked cupboards. Policies and procedures will address the personal safety and security of persons with developmental disabilities that they support. Service agencies will maintain adequate staff support at a level identified in the person's individual support plan to address the safety, security, and well-being of the person they support. This could include written protocols outlining supervision and environmental controls within the home and community. The level of support that a person needs, including the level of staffing support to be provided, will be identified through the individual support planning process and will be agreed to by all people, service agencies, and professionals who are party to the support plan. Once the individual support plan is approved, the service agency is required to provide the level of support as outlined in the individual support plan. If the service agency cannot provide the appropriate level of staff support, then alternative services and support should be considered. If a person is refusing support for even short periods of time, the service agency should note this in the person's file. In cases where the health, safety, and security of the person is threatened, the appropriate people and/or authorities should be notified, such as the police, medical personnel, or anyone acting on behalf of the person. Service agencies need to have policies and procedures related to persons who withdraw from services and supports. All staff members and volunteers must receive an orientation and training on the service agency's policies and procedures and the individual needs of the persons with developmental disabilities whom the staff member or volunteer will support. Agencies will document the date of orientation and initial training, as well as any future training on providing support to persons with developmental disabilities. Documentation should be maintained in the staff member's current personnel file. To be proactive in the recruitment process and assess a potential employee's and/or volunteer's suitability for working at the agency and with persons with a developmental disability, a personal reference check and police records check are required. Confirmation must be maintained in the personnel file. A police records check is a record of a person's involvement with the police obtained through a search of police databases and includes a review of the vulnerable sector screen. A personal reference check and police records check will be completed for volunteers and board members if they have direct contact with the persons with developmental disabilities. Service agencies will have written protocols with local police services to ensure the type of information provided through a police record check is appropriate to the position being applied for. The personal reference check and police records check must be completed as soon as possible for the new staff member, volunteer, or board member. Until the completion of the reference check and police records check and their orientation and initial training, a staff member, volunteer, or board member shall only have direct contact with persons with a developmental disability when being supervised. Service agencies will consider its record-keeping practices and maintain a record for each person applying for services, which will include a copy of the person's application for developmental services and supports, supports intensity scale needs assessment, and individual support plan. The person's service record will be retained for a minimum of 7 years after the person is no longer receiving service and supports from the agency. Service agencies will have policies and procedures on service record retention and secure storage. Going forward, agencies will ensure that all new persons who come into service have the most up-to-date common application form and a common assessment tool, the SIS, on file. It is recognized that people who are already receiving services and supports from a developmental service agency will not immediately have all of the service records identified in Section 14 of the regulation, such as the application package and SIS assessment. As and when this documentation becomes available, it is to be included with the person's service records. Within 5 years after the application entities open, July 1st, 2011, all individuals with a developmental disability who are in service will have an application for developmental services and supports completed. Many people already receiving services will have other relevant documents on file that should be retained until the new required documentation is available. This documentation may include their application for service, intake records, and clinical, medical, and behavioral assessments. This ends Part 2. Thank you.